Hello, everyone. Welcome to our East Coast launch for Giant by T.A. Barron. Before we jump into the fun things, I have a few little housekeeping things I need to go over. First of which is that for all Books of Wonder events, we expect all participants to maintain a family-friendly atmosphere inclusive of respect and fairness. Anyone who violates this standard of behavior, including engaging in any form of harassment, inappropriate language, or disruptive conduct, will, at our discretion, be immediately removed. On to slightly more fun things. If you do not already have your signed copy of Giant by T.A. Barron, there's a link right here, this big, beautiful green button. And if you click the big, beautiful green button, it will take you to the Books of Wonder website where you can buy your copies. We also have a link in the chat right over there. Feel free to chat in the chat, by the way. We love seeing everybody's excitement for these launches. And if you have any questions for this incredible human being next to me, there is the Ask a Question box right below the Buy Your Copy box. Put your questions in there so I don't miss them in the chat, and I will be reappearing towards the end of the event to make sure we can get to all of your questions. Now, without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce T.A. Barron. He is the award-winning author of many best-selling books, including the Merlin saga, soon to be a major motion picture. He serves on a variety of environmental and educational boards and is the founder of a national award for heroic children, the Gloria Barron Prize for Young Heroes. Following a career change to become a writer, Barron has written over 30 books, including many international bestsellers. He is happiest when hiking with his family in the Colorado mountains.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Books of Wonder, one of my favorite places on this planet or on any planet. And also welcome to my writing room. I can't tell you how delighted I am. First of all, to welcome you here in this space. I think you could probably tell looking around you. My writing room here is a combination of a library, an outdoor recreation center. Pretty much it has backpacks and a tent and some old hiking boots over there. And also, I would say it's also an art gallery that is filled with wonderful creative art from my friends and fans from all around the world, every continent, people who have carved me wizard staffs or sent me crystals or magical amulets or all manner of objects. And so I guess you could say that this place is my version of Merlin's Crystal Cave. And it is where I write the books. And even though we'd all much prefer to be together in that wonderful sacred place called Books of Wonder, it's special to welcome you all virtually right here into my writing room. I hope you can feel the creative vibes. We're going to talk a bit about the mysterious and quirky process of writing books. But first, I would like to hearken back to something very special, which is the fact that my very first book event ever was in this very store, Books of Wonder, 30 plus years ago. At that time, the wonderful man who founded Books of Wonder, Peter Glassman, invited me to come and talk about my first book named Heartlights. And just to make sure that someone actually would come, Peter also asked a wonderful person who was a dear friend of both of ours, the marvelous sage and inspirational person who was also a stellar writer named Madeline L'Engle. And I can even show you the handout from that event back in 1990, where Books of Wonder had on display a big, beautiful blue-winged butterfly with Grandfather and Kate seated on the back, flying off into the stars. And that window display, by the way, is now here in my writing room. It's above my head. It's you can see just a bit of the wings of the butterfly up there. But that soaring butterfly from Books of Wonder more than 30 years ago is always with me when I'm creating in this special space. And I'm sure it adds its own particular magic. So I want to thank Books of Wonder and Peter Glassman from the bottom of my heart, and Madeline as well. It's been a great journey for now more than 30 years. So now here we are, even virtually, creating this shared space of storytelling. I've been told by our moderator, Zoe, that there were people here attending from all around the world. I want to say a special hello to my friend Lisa Buchholz from Germany, who's on the line. And I'm also, by the way, going to point right over to where there are a couple of hawk feathers from the Birdman, where you took me, Lisette, up above Heidelberg. So I'm going to now turn the conversation to that mysterious thing that happens that we call story. And I guess the best way to start is to quote the wisest words I've ever heard about the magic of storytelling. And those words are, there are exactly 3 essential rules to writing the perfect book. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are. It is true. It is true. But I will tell you a little bit about what I have learned in this 30 plus years, and now more than 30 books, Giant being my 32nd child in this literary form. I'm happy to tell you that the process is still as mysterious as ever to me, but I have learned a few things, perhaps most importantly, that if I'm going to tell a story that we all get to share in, and I really mean that word sharing, to me, a writer is nothing without bright, thoughtful, caring readers like all of you. We do co-create these stories together. That's always been my view. And it becomes this marvelous experience wherever I've been around the world doing book events. Now the books are in, I think, 27 different languages. I'm always just very moved by the fact that stories cross every single boundary that humanity continues to erect to separate ourselves from each other. Boundaries of language, culture, geography, religion, boundaries of time, boundaries of distance. All of those things vanish if it's a good story that connects people. Suddenly, language doesn't matter, time doesn't matter, distance doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the human heart, and stories connect us on that level. So it's an enormous honor. I feel grateful every single day that I get to work in this space and create stories that I hope will enrich and inspire all of you in the process as we co-create them. Now, another thing I've learned is that to create anything, and I mean anything, not just a story, but I'm sure it's true with a work of art like a symphony or a painting or a sculpture. To create anything, you need to enliven both sides of the brain. So as we all know from the neuroscience of this, the left side of the brain, which is connected to the right hand, is the center for logic and rationality. And you need that if you're going to tell a story. You have to think about the arc of characters and the ways they're going to grow, the ways themes cross-cut, the difference of pacing between something that's super fast and adventurous and something that lets you take a breath. All of those different elements. And then the right side of the brain, which is connected to the left hand, is about poetry, about metaphor. It's the place where dreams arise. And I think truly beautiful and wondrous creative art of whatever kind has tapped into both sides of the brain. And that's where it springs forth like a spiritual waterfall. And we can feel its inspiration long after we've actually experienced walking through that waterfall or drinking from it. It's with us. So for each author, I think it's a different process to unlock both sides of the brain. But for me, it has always helped to start writing by hand. So I always actually begin writing by hand. These are my original notes from the very first time, more than 2 years ago, when I sat down to sketch out early ideas for this book about the origins of Shim, who many of you already know is one of the most beloved characters in all of the Merlin saga. And that's a lot of characters, more than 150 of them. But Shim's backstory was particularly intriguing, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. But I write it by hand, and then I do an expanded version of that, also by hand. And you know, my version of cut and paste is with the scissors and some tape and insertions like this. It's a mess, but it works. Now, some of you might ask, why do that in this era of high technology? Why would anybody ever write by hand? Well, the reason is simply it works. And I think it's probably partly because it harkens back to the chemistry of my first creative exploits as a kid, just leaning back against an old apple tree at my family home and writing my first poems or ideas for stories or character sketches. That's so I think I'm tapping into that. And in any case, I don't know how, but it elementally works. It gets my right brain working and my left brain as well. Then I produce something that's in a printed type form, but once again, I'm not ready to put aside that right brain, left hand side that requires handwriting, and so I really have fun messing it all up. Here's some more examples of these are the pages of my early outline for Giant, and you can see, you know, there's a lot. It's a living, organic project. There's a lot of things happening here. So finally, when I'm ready, I actually sit down with my blue pen and white pad of paper, and I actually begin to write it by hand. And I write my entire first draft of every book I write by hand. So yes, it's true. Even the big full meals of stories like the Great Tree of Avalon trilogy, which many of you I know have read, that big trilogy that's way more than 1,000 pages. I wrote the first draft by hand. Then I get it onto a computer where I can work it and edit it, and I do many drafts, usually 7 or 8, sometimes 9, full rewrites to finally get it to the point where we have a book. So here we are with the book that results from that whole process. Now, we're going to do a little deeper dive into this story, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about it. And I would love to read to you a selection from Giant. But first, I want to set the stage by saying that Giant really truly began. If a story is a tree, and you know I'm very fond of trees, with Tree Girl and the Ancient One and the Great Tree of Avalon and so many other magical trees in my stories. If a story is a tree, though, at its origin, what is the seed of that tree? What is the initial very, very microscopic little bit of magic that begins that tree on its journey of sprouting and growing and maybe even becoming a world tree like Avalon's great tree is. For me, it was a dream. 27 years ago, 27 years ago this fall, I woke up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night with a dream about a boy who was drowning and then washed ashore on a magical island. That island was Finkyra. And that island went, but the boy who washed ashore was barely keeping himself alive, and actually he was spat out by the waves onto the shore of this harsh coastline, and he hit his head on the rocks, and all he could hear were seagulls screeching over his head, and he was so weak he couldn't even sit up. This boy, he couldn't even know his own name because he had forgotten his whole identity. Everything about his prior life had disappeared. When he finally sat up and crawled a little higher out of those waves that were trying to pull against his torn tunic and drag him back into the ocean, he managed to look upwards at the sky, and that's when he realized that not only was he alone, not only was he lost, but he was bereft of any memory at all. And in that lowest of low moments, his only wish is to survive. Now, that he actually does survive that day, and there's more to come, is a miracle. But that he might someday actually grow up to be the celebrated, wondrous character we call Merlin, the greatest wizard of all times, that is an even greater miracle. But of course, he knew none of this. And yet, when I woke up in that dream, in that moment, when the boy was staring up in the sky, I realized, oh my God, this is Merlin. This is Merlin. And that began my journey 27 years ago to write all 12, now 13 books in the Merlin saga. Now, this book that we're talking about here is the origin story of one of the most beloved characters in the Merlin saga, whose name, as you know, is Shim. This is the secret of his origins. He's a little tiny fellow who protests against all evidence that he is actually really a giant. And well, who knows? He just might be. In book 1 of the Merlin saga, he does learn what it really means to be a giant. But in this book, he has to lose his giant status, become shrunken down, or as he would put it in his weird and wonderful way of speaking, shrunkled. He has to also, by the way, save the person he loves more than anyone else in the world, and he has to remember something incredibly important that he has lost. Oh, yeah, and there was one more thing. He has to save the world. So, no biggie, right? So, with that, I will say that this book now is part of a family. It is the first book in this entire series of 13. It is also a book you could read by itself as a standalone story. Giant is a complete story all in itself. You don't have to read the rest of the Merlin saga. But Giant is also your gateway into the worlds of Merlin. All these other 12 books and all of Merlin's worlds await you once you have read Giant. If you like what you experience here, if you like being on that magical and troubled and dangerous and mysterious island called Finkyra, this is your entry right here. So without further ado, I would love to read to you a small passage from Giant. And after I do that, we are going to have the fun of opening this up to questions, because for me, the Q&A is always the heart of these book events. And, with all of the thousands of book events I've done over these years, I love the Q&A the best, because then we get to talk about what you all would most like to talk about. So let's dive in. And as Jim would say, his favorite phrase, certainly, definitely, absolutely. Here we go. Relax, kick back, and allow me, please, to read to you a passage from Giant. In this scene, early in the book, Shim is on a walk in the forest, the enchanted forest of Finkyra, and suddenly he meets one of the most fierce, dangerous, terrible beasts in all of the Isle, a wyvern, which you may know is a small but ferocious kind of dragon. And in that moment, Shim also meets someone else, someone who just might change his life. An immense owl took flight and glided silently over to her nest in the hollow of a cypress tree. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the forest. Shim halted in his tracks, instantly recognizing the shrill, angry cry made by only one kind of beast, a wyvern. He ran toward the sound, scaling the ravine and topping the next rise in just a few giant-sized bounds. As the shrieking grew louder, he started to hear other, very different sounds as well. Thunderous booms and crashes, along with a chorus of tiny voices that cried out in agony. Bursting out of the trees into a clearing, he saw the wyvern, a powerful one with gleaming purple scales that covered his entire body from the tips of his jagged wings to the heavy ball of bone at the end of his tail. Shrieking wildly, the purple wyvern lunged repeatedly at a deep cavern in an immense outcropping of stone. As his wings slapped the air, his deadly claws slashed at the cavern entrance, breaking off chunks of rock. Small winged creatures, glowing bright blue but moving too fast for Shim to see clearly, buzzed around the wyvern's head. All the while, the little beings wailed piteously. Sometimes the wyvern's jaws snapped closed on them, abruptly ending their lives. More of them fell from his slapping wings. With every passing second, their numbers lessened, their glow forever extinguished. The wyvern kept slashing at the cavern, clearly searching for something. Suddenly, he reared back and slammed the ball of his tail against the entrance, smashing the outcropping so hard that several boulders broke off, crushing more of the glowing blue creatures. All the while, the dragon-like beast screeched furiously, a cry meant to freeze anyone nearby in terror. But not Shim. Enraged by this brutality, he roared and ran headlong into battle. He threw all his weight into the charge, slamming full force into the wyvern's shoulder. Shrieking louder than ever, the surprised beast rolled backward, slicing his jaw on a sharp edge of stone. Purple blood oozed from the wound. The wyvern whirled around to face his attacker, blood dripping from his lower lip, fires of revenge burning in his eyes. Shim, who had been thrown backward by the impact, rolled aside just in time to avoid the wyvern's tail, which smashed down on that very spot. Leaping up, he grabbed a huge boulder and hurled it at the wyvern. The beast jumped, but the boulder dipped one wing, ripping the boulder clipped one wing, ripping off a whole row of scales that sprinkled the ground amidst bits of stone and the bodies of lifeless little beings. Raging, the wyvern whipped his jagged wings and brandished his claws, preparing to attack. All his thoughts were now bent on just one goal: revenge. Shim knew that a single slice from those claws could sever his arm, or worse. He lunged for another boulder even bigger than the first. With all his strength, he lifted it to throw, but the rock was so heavy that he wobbled unsteadily. Then he lost his balance, tumbling over on the ground. The wyvern snarled, sensing victory. Knowing that his enemy would soon perish, the beast's eyes flashed brighter. Slowly he raised his claws, poised to vanquish this bold young giant who had dared to intrude. Just as the wyvern was about to leap, he noticed a small, shiny object at the edge of the cavern, shimmering with a strange orange glow. This object caught his full attention. A greedy rumble reverberated in the wyvern's throat as he stared, spellbound. Taking advantage of the delay, Shim stood up. He braced himself and grasped the boulder again, lifting it high enough to throw. With every fiber of his muscles, he hurled it at the wyvern. In a flash, the wyvern dodged the boulder and leaped, not at Shim, but at the orange prize that had caught his attention. Grasping the object in his claws, he took off with a last triumphant shriek that shook the nearby trees. As he flew away, blood still dripping from his jaw, he cast a vengeful glance back at the unexpected foe who had caused so much trouble. Shim stared back at the departing wyvern. Though shaky from all the stress of battle, he stood tall as possible. And tall was what he felt again. No longer the hauntingly small likeness that he'd seen earlier that day in the mist, but a giant in every way, big enough and brave enough to scare off a wyvern. Then, looking down, he caught his breath. That terrible bully had destroyed dozens of innocent lives. Tiny, broken bodies lay scattered everywhere. Some still had their delicate blue wings attached, while others were torn to shreds. None of them showed any signs of life. Fairies! Recognizing them from the stories his mother had told him, he bent down to look closer. Though their only movement now came from the gentle breeze that stirred their broken and tattered wings, he knew that these tiny blue beings had once been among the most beautiful and graceful creatures in all of Finkyra. Luminous fairies, he said to himself, recalling their species name. Like all the other kinds of fairies, wondrous beings who lived in watery places, or moss carpets, or starflower meadows across the island, these fairies had translucent wings and elegant antennae, and their own special magic. But no other fairy had magic equal to that of the luminous fairies, for these fairies could actually produce their own light, glowing as they flew, like small winged stars. A tiny flicker of blue over by the cavern caught his eye. Barely perceptible, it seemed no more than a single spark, probably just the light glinting on a shard of stone. Nevertheless, he moved closer to investigate. He gasped. It came from a fairy. Though bedraggled and smudged with dirt, the tiny creature flickered ever so slightly. Pale blue light glowed on her whole body, from the tip of her nose to the edges of her wings, which seemed as evanescent as rainbows. With greatest care, Shim picked up the fairy and held her in the palm of his hand. Smaller than his fingernail, she quivered, glowing weakly. Slowly, she seemed to revive, straightening her two antennae, which each ended with a rounded knob that resembled a bell. Gold in color, those bell-shaped knobs were the only parts of her that weren't radiant blue. The fairy's light grew stronger, bit by bit. Finally, she opened her eyes, which shone as bright blue as the sunlit sky. For several heartbeats, the fairy looked up at Shim. Then she shook her antenna, and a slow, somber ringing filled the air. For those golden knobs were indeed bells, and now they rang out in sorrow. "My family," moaned the little fairy in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. "My family, My whole colony attacked without any warning by that wyvern, finished the giant. They is truly bad, horribobulous things. Leaning his face closer so that his bulbous nose almost touched the delicate creature in his hand, he said softly, I am so verily sorry for you. The fairy ceased ringing her antenna bells. Peering up at the giant, she said sadly, Today I lost everything. My family, my home, everything. She paused, quivering. But I also found something. What? Someone very brave.
I think that's my cue.
Well,
Isn't
I hope you all enjoyed that reading as much as I enjoyed the writing.
What a fabulous note to end on. I don't know if that doesn't make you want to buy this book today. I think you just need to buy the book today. Alrighty, we have some really fun questions to get into. I think first I'm going to start with a question for the map nerds in our audience here today, because I myself am also a big book map nerd. And I'd love to ask you, because I know it has been a minute since you have worked with any designers for new maps, I'm sure. But I'd love to talk about the process of designing these maps of Finkara. It's one of those things, Finkara. You read it so much and then you forget how to really pronounce the thing.
That's fine.
That's been my problem ever since I was a child. But yes, please.
Let's talk about maps. Now, the first thing to know is, for me, in writing a story, I need three things. I need a character I really love, a character I really care about. It could be the villain, by the way. It could be the hero. It could, and it's most likely the unlikeliest possible, most vulnerable, most downcast character who becomes a hero, perhaps through an amazing journey that we all get to experience, just like Shem, just like Kate in The Ancient One, or Heartlight, or The Merlin Effect, just like Merlin, or Rhea, or the beloved hawk Trouble, just like Promi and Atlanta in the Atlantis trilogy, just like all of those young heroes I wrote about in The Hero's Trail, or Anna in Tree Girl, any of these books. You have to have a character that you really care about as the writer, and you really come to know, so I can introduce her or him or it to you now, or them. This character has a place in our story. So does a big idea, a big moral question that I love to use the realm of story to tease out. And finally, the third piece is a place, a magical place, a place that we all can go and spend time and come back to and be nerds about the maps. And so I actually always hand draw my first map of the place. And now in the last 15 years, I've drawn all the maps of my books. But we'll talk about that in a moment. But the point I want to really emphasize is the place has to feel not just like the backdrop of a story, not just like the setting of a story, but in fact, it has to rise up in complexity and nuance and stature so that it's actually one of the characters, one of the prime characters of a story. So whether it's Finkyra, or whether it's the root realms of Avalon, this wonderful woodcut version of my hand drawing of Finkyra was done by Ian Schoner, who did just a fabulous job. And then I drew this for the Great Tree of Avalon books. These are the root realms of Avalon, and you see the black and white version in the books and in color on my website. Now, similarly, I drew the map of Atlantis for the Atlantis trilogy, and had a great time doing that. I'm a believer that a place really has to step forward. And what do I mean by making it a character? It has a history. It has mood swings. It can be dark and scary and dangerous. It can also be beautiful and surprising. It can be deeply, deeply mysterious. All of these qualities become the place and infuse it, and really make it become truly a player on this stage. So I would say that if you love maps like me, you're already halfway there to voyaging to wondrous, wondrous places in the imagination. And I'll add one more thing. I think this is even more important in fantasy than it is in traditional realistic fiction, because while you have to make places real in regular fiction, you have to work even harder to make them real in a place where the rules are different. And if you do it well enough, those rules become natural and they feel authentic, but they're that much more fun and surprising and mysterious because they are different. So the place is always very important.
I love that. How would you then, since building on the idea of the world as a character, what personality traits did you give to Finkara?
Great question. You know, when I'm drawing the map and redrawing the map in the course of that year and a half, 2 years it takes to write a novel, it goes from doing a sketch of an outline of a place to becoming like painting the portrait of a friend. And that's how well I've come to know it. And so in Finkara, there had to be a particular element of strange and surprising diversity on this island, because it is, remember, it is positioned between mortal world of Earth and immortal world of the spirit realm. So it has elements of both. It's really the place in between, the place that's not mortal nor immortal, but something of both. In fact, I found the name Finkara when I was doing my research before starting in the Merlin books after I'd had that dream. I spent more than a year reading every possible thing I ever could find about Merlin, and really understanding the lore, and also understanding this beautiful complex web of tapestry that had been made over the centuries, 1,500 years since the first oral traditions about Merlin. But I found that there was a hole in that tapestry, a gap, a place where I could weave in new threads, and yet at the same time I wanted them to match what was outside. But it gave me tremendous freedom as a storyteller to create this place. So in writing about Finkara, I had to think, okay, what is this going to be? This had to be elements of the future mentor of King Arthur. He's going to have to learn how to live backwards in time. He's going to have to meet characters of all immense possible diversities, characters from lots of different mythic origins, not just Celtic lore. He had to learn about love. He had to learn about power. He had to learn about courage. He had to learn about grief by losing someone he loves. He had to learn about loyalty, about generosity, about compassion, to become the great wizard we know and love as Merlin. Finkara would have to show him and teach him, and sometimes by enormous struggle and difficulty, he would have to grow. But that's how that boy who washes ashore on the first page of book one that I was describing goes to become ultimately the greatest wizard of all times. And Finkyra is the place where it happens.
Oh my gosh, I'm just hanging off everything you say. I feel like we could have a 2 hours long discussion about your research just alone, but I want to make sure that we get to all of our audience questions, so I am going to restrain myself. Actually, we have another one coming off of the map discussion, so that seems like a fitting transition. Is drawing your maps ever an escape from the demands of writing? Do you ever get kind of caught up in the drawing of maps?
Oh yeah, no question. Writing for me is so much harder work. In fact, I'll put it this way: writing is for me the hardest labor I have ever done, and I've done a whole lot of different jobs in my life, from teaching school to helping build a log cabin to running a small business to doing all kinds of other things. But really, truly, the hardest job is writing. But it is also the most joyous work I've ever done. So go figure. But you have to do the hard work in order to get the ultimate joy of sharing a story, a character, a place, and some big ideas with caring, wonderful, deeply intelligent people like all of you who are tuned in here to Books of Wonders event. Now, how do we stage this process so that I have the energy to actually do what I have to do? Honestly, I save drawing the final version of the map until the very last thing. The book is done. I have, at least it's a done, like good solid third draft that I'm ready to share now with my editor. And then I clear off everything off our round breakfast table in our kitchen, and I bring out my pen and ink, and I bring out my pencils, and of course the sketch that I've worked and reworked and erased and changed and ripped and everything else. And then I really start to do a pen and ink beautiful rendition of this place on that kitchen table. And it's just such a joy. I just can't tell you. It's after all of that labor. It's like I've run a few marathons in my day. The craziest one was running the Pikes Peak Marathon here in Colorado. The story about the Pikes Peak Marathon is, the good news is there's only one hill. The bad news is it's 14,000 feet high.
Ooh.
But really at the very end of that, Zoe, to have a drink of water was nirvana. And that's kind of how I feel the drawing of this map is like that drink of water.
I love that. That's amazing. Oh my gosh. I think I had like 5 more map questions spring to mind, but I am going to stay on track with these audience questions. Next up, I would love to discuss, how did the idea of a small giant first come to you? It's such a fun and fascinating play on our traditions of what a giant is.
That one is easy.
Yeah.
Because I'm a dad.
Oh.
And every one of my children has started out as a little tiny person in physical size who is truly a great, big, growing, magnificent person inside. And to be in their presence, you soon realize as a parent, wow, these little beings are really actually very big people, just in a small package. And that's why I dedicated Giant to all the little giants I have known.
Aww.
And there are 5 of them. So I'm a very lucky dad to have known them. And that's really, they get the credit for putting the idea in my head. And they are the original giants in my life.
Aww. That is so sweet. Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay. So going off of that note, I adore that. That was so cute. What inspired you to return? Because we discussed when we were in the green room how it's been almost a decade since you've been in writing in this world. What inspired you to return after so long?
honestly, so many people love Shim. And I think that next to Merlin and Rhea, Shim is the most beloved and cherished character, possibly because he's the funniest character in all the Merlin books. But he's walked off the pages into a lot of people's hearts all around the world. And I get letters from all manner of different cultures and languages that tell me for sure there's something universal in Shim. And perhaps it's the fact that all of us as children one day would have loved to have been big and powerful. And Shim has to discover that truly being a giant is about more than just the size of your bones. So in the course of these stories, though, now in however millions of copies around the world, I get so many comments and questions about Shim. And when I'm back to doing physical events, I'm sure those will continue. And even the people at Disney who've been working hard on the movie of the Merlin saga um, have peppered me with questions over this last several years about how did Shim come to be? Why did he get so small? Who is he really? Where did it start? And I thought, you know what? It's time now to write that story.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I also then decided it should be a prequel to everything else because nobody should have to read the other 12 books first before they can enter into Shim's magical story, which is by itself a rather remarkable journey. So,
Definitely.
and by the way, this book ends literally seconds before Merlin and Rhea appear on that very same spot. So when you're at the end and you read the last paragraph of the last chapter, you'll see exactly where that syncs up into book one.
I love that. That is brilliant. Thank you. Um, Kind of going off of that then, how did it feel returning to this world?
Oh, it really did feel like coming home.
Aw.
I've known and loved this place so much, and that's part of the delight, both for writers and readers, of creating a universe that actually has enough depth to it that all of us can enter into that place and then go away and live our lives and work and love and do everything else that we do, and then come back. So a reader can have an enormously authentic experience, and maybe several times over, and then they could go away for a decade or 2 decades and come back and to write it. And I get a lot of letters and comments on social media from people who are doing exactly that. Now introducing these stories, I can't believe it's been that long, but they are out there long enough that some of my initial readers back in the 1990s are sharing these stories with their children, which is a crazy thing I can't even begin to wrap my mind around. But it's part of this long procession of writers and readers and storytellers. You think about it, this grand world of story is just so immense and so wonderful. I've got to show you something, Zoe. This
Yeah.
is the amulet, which
Oh my gosh.
my friend Lisette will recognize.
Yeah.
And my German editor, Anna Schickel, will recognize. Because at one of my appearances at the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is the largest book festival in the world, I did an event and there were people from all different countries, not just from Europe, but from other parts of the world too. My Japanese readers came, and it was a wonderful experience. I was signing international editions, and at the very end, a very large fellow was waiting for everyone else to leave, and he was so big. He was almost 7 feet tall, I'm sure, and he wore a big, huge cape. He also was wearing a ton of metal on himself. So if there had been a lightning strike somewhere near Frankfurt, he might have gotten a ricochet. And anyway, he had so the most awesome tattoos, and all over him. And he waited, and my German publicist, a wonderful man named Thomas Zernbauer, said, Mr. Barron, would you like me to call security? And I said, are you kidding? I know by now the person who waits to the very end of a book signing really has something special to say. And besides, I live in a college town, and I see people like this all the time.
Yeah.
This is my life. So anyway, finally, the last person in the line leaves next, and this fellow walks up with his cape streaming behind him, 7 feet tall, all this wonderful tattoos and metal, and then he spoke in perfect English, only the hint of a German accent. Hello, my name is Jeffrey, and I am the leader of a clan of druids. We live in the forest of Bavaria, and I have walked here to Frankfurt to tell you how much we appreciate all of your Merlin books, the books that celebrate our founder, Merlin. You have done us such a great service in the world. And he said, I just want to thank you for bringing Merlin back into the world. And I said, wait a minute, totally stop, Jeffrey. You give me way too much credit. Merlin is already here in the biggest of ways. I'm only the latest of thousands of people to sing songs about him, to write stories about him. And I'm honored to be one of those many people, part of that chorus. Well, anyway, I ended up finally waiting until he nodded and then said, nevertheless, I have something for you. And he took off of his neck one of those metal objects that he was wearing, this amulet of an oak tree with a tiger's eye gem right there. And he put it over my head and he said, this is to remind you that the stories you write will touch people far and wide, people you may never meet, people you will never, ever know existed. But your stories will be part of their lives, just like they're part of my life and my people's lives. And then he turned around. I was speechless, but it was good that he was ready to leave because I couldn't have said anything. He turned around and with a swish of his cape, he walked off. And his dusty sandals, clapping on the wooden floor behind him. And I have worn this every single day since. That was more than a decade ago, and I'll never forget it. And not just because of the crazy, wonderful moment of it happening, but because of the message that Jeffrey wanted to remind me of, that stories really do connect us all. And it's a deeply humbling thing to be part of this whole world of storytelling. And that's why I have this great rush of gratitude in being able to now have a universe here in Merlin's worlds. If you look at book 12, Merlin's Book of Magic, there are way more than 100, I think over 150 different entries of characters, magical objects, places that are in all of the worlds that Merlin inhabits. And these are the little backstories, the hidden parts of their background that I didn't reveal in the books, but I had to know as the writer before I could share them. So that book 12 is just a little bit of an emblem of this universe. And I am just a lucky trail guide who gets to lead people on hikes in this marvelous, ever-changing, mysterious, wondrous place called Finkyra and Merlin's world.
That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that moment. That sounds like it was incredible.
It was. If Jeffrey is on this call listening in, thank you. Dankeschön.
Somehow we are already running short on time. There are a couple more questions I'd love to try to get through. So if we're able to, yay. If not, I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. The next question is, in reading your books, it's very clear that two of the big positive influences on you as a writer are Madeleine L'Engle and Lloyd Alexander. What other children's book authors have had a major influence on you?
Oh, golly, I have enjoyed so many wondrous writers. But I'm going to say it's bigger than that already wondrous universe of children's book writers. And oh, there are so many. Heavens. I'm gonna say I want you to think about a basket for the best of children's literature and a basket for the best of poetry that truly is evocative and speaks directly to our hearts without all the layering of prose. It's a magical thing.
Yeah.
The best of nature writing, wondrous writers like Thoreau and John Muir and Rachel Carson had changed my life and helped me, taught me how to see with all of my senses and bring those places that I write about fully alive. I've also benefited from reading a lot of myth and lore from diverse traditions, from different Native American traditions, from the Celtic lore, of course, that I've spent a lot of time writing about, but also Greek myths and Japanese fairy tales, and also some of the tales out of Southern Africa. I really feel, again, I'm just a baby sloshing around in this little pond that is filled by rivers and tributaries that flow in from all manners of humanity, all different locations, all different sources. The only thing they share in common is the human heart.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Two more questions if we have time for it. What can you tell us about the Disney Merlin movie?
I'm glad you asked because I was actually up this morning at 5 a.m.
Oh
Emailing
my.
with the new director who's been brought on board and who happens to live on a different continent. I will say this: Disney has brought on a tremendous, talented, and diverse group of people onto this project, and and you can read about them if you like on my website. Just go to the Merlin the movie page of tabarron.com. But the best thing I can tell you is that I feel like anybody who has known me or followed me over the years knows that I've been working with people to try and make this a reality for a while. And I sometimes feel like all of Merlin's wild adventures in the books are nothing compared to the wild adventures I've had trying to help this happen. But the Disney people have stayed true to the core values and the key elements of the Merlin saga. This movie, of course, is going to be different from the books, and it's mostly book one that the movie is about. But it's going to be different in a way that makes the same basic story come alive on the screen that has come alive in our minds and hearts through a book. So it feels to me very, very true, just a different medium. And I'm thrilled about that. And I have a very strong feeling that wherever Merlin is right now, he is pleased. So I just, maybe in wrapping up, Zoe, I would like to just invite anybody whose question I didn't get to answer tonight, and there are so many wonderful questions out there. I'd like you to come to my website and explore, because on that website there are ample opportunities for resources in every realm for aspiring writers, for people who love nature and our fellow creatures as I do, for people who are into the young heroes and why it is that I'm inspired by these young people. And the best of all are the real young people who are as diverse as America is diverse. And it's a beautiful, moving, and deeply inspiring thing to know that these young people are out there doing important work. They never got the memo that kids don't have any power to change the world. And it's that's the whole idea of my little prize that I named after my mother, Gloria Barron, is to turn the spotlight on these wonderful young people. So just like the fictional heroes in my books, but better, these kids are able to surmount just terrible obstacles, but find a way to bring the heroic qualities of courage and compassion out in themselves. And they not only help themselves, they help the world,
That's
our
incredible.
world.
For sure. Oh my gosh. Children really are inspiring.
They are. They are.
One last thing that I want to ask that I love to ask at every event. I know Giant like literally just came out.
Yeah. You're
What
not
do
going to ask me about what's next, are you?
Yes, I am. What do you have
Oh,
coming out next?
you know how unfair that is. I will tell you this. I am toying with several ideas right now.
Yeah.
Among them, actually, a particularly strange and magical tree. But all of these ideas are in the very early stage. It's even too soon to draw a map. But when I know what it is, I promise you that Books of Wonder will also know what it is.
Very excited. Thank you so much, TA. This was phenomenal. And what an amazing, magical way to spend the evening. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to our audience members for joining us. And one last reminder, we just dropped the link for Giant in the chat once more. We've got that beautiful orange link and this big, beautiful green button down below us. Please, please, please click on those links and buy your signed copies of Giant. TA, thank you so much.
My pleasure. And thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Books of Wonder. And thank you, all of you out there who co-create these stories with me. I hope you'll have many, many magical journeys, not just in my books, but in the world of stories.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.